Florida has garnered a reputation as a weird state.
Sunshine, oranges, but of course, Florida man.
Florida man is lucky to have all of his limbs.
A man in Polk County called 911 to report a drunk driver, himself.
Making fun of Florida has become part of the American canon, but despite being the butt of jokes, Florida is booming.
Every year, more than 330,000 people are moving to Florida, according to state economists.
We've seen a surge in residents coming largely from 3 states, New York, California, and New Jersey. But with a rising population comes a wide array of new challenges. Florida feels like a ticking time bomb that could go off at any minute. We've experienced incredible growth that our state really relies on, and growth is good, right? Everyone wants to grow. It's human nature to just want more. But what happens when the growth stops? Let's take a look back at the history of the Sunshine State to understand how we got here. The rain is picking up. No! It feels like recording right now is a ticking time bomb.
Back in 1940, the idea that Florida would pass New York in population was laughable. The Sunshine State had just under 2 million residents, making it the least populous state in the American South. New York, on the other hand, had the largest population in the entire country with 13.4 million residents.
How did this hot, mosquito-infested swampland become the 3rd most populous state in the nation?
In the 1880s, wealthy Americans began to use Florida as a winter vacation spot, a sunny haven for those trying to escape the cold back home. People like Henry Flagler were so enamored by the state that they decided to invest, building railroads and hotels, making it more accessible to the average American.
Geographically, Florida should be a part of the Deep South, but the Northerners that came here had a giant influence on the culture.
Because of this, Florida became more culturally southern in the northernmost part of the state that borders the rest of the American South, and more culturally northern within its own South, where vacations had been more popular.
As much as Floridians like myself make fun of snowbirds who fly south for the winter, they've been a big part of Florida history for 140 years, long before most people would even consider living here permanently.
But what did it take for people to move here? What was the straw that broke the camel's back? It wasn't just the sunshine or the oranges, it was the invention of the air conditioner.
This young lady is responsible for the weather in her home. It's as easy as child's play.
Classic window units would hit Florida houses for the first time in 1951, completely revolutionizing what was possible in the state. It didn't just have to be a vacation spot anymore, people could actually live here. During World War II, millions of young people came to Florida for the first time through its air and naval bases, falling in love with the state just like the vacationers that came before them. August 13th, 1945, VJ Day, where the United States declared victory over Japan, was one of the happiest days in Florida history. Millions of young Americans celebrated the victory, celebrated that they could go home, but they had also built a special bond with Florida's sunny beaches. A report from the Florida Center for Instructional Technology sums up the effect of this by saying 2 million servicemen left the state, all of them vowing to return someday, and almost all of them would, as tourists, as transplants, as retirees. Historian Gary Mormino has done some incredible work on the Sunshine State, and his books serve as the primary source for this video.
He talks in depth about the idea of the Florida dream. He says that Florida and California are dream states, beautiful sunny retreats with long coastlines and swaying palm trees.
A 1945 poll by George Gallup asking what states Americans would like to move to had California and Florida in the 2 top spots, and Florida was the cheaper of the 2.
It quickly became the object of these young people's desires. The state's population would surge from 1.9 million in 1940 to 2.7 million in 1950. I've seen a lot of boomer memes that are like, Florida, we live where you vacation, and I've always sort of rolled my eyes at them, but I think that there's something very real about that sentiment.
During the war, a pesticide was developed in Florida which was used all over the state to get rid of the petulant mosquitoes that polluted this picturesque paradise.
This made Florida a lot more bearable for the rapidly growing population, but it was detrimental to the wildlife and the environment, eventually even getting banned in 1972. Here's an interesting question. What singular person had the largest effect on Florida in the back half of the 20th century? You might be thinking of some governor or mayor or even some sort of developer, but the person I'm talking about wasn't even an American citizen. Mormino argues that the most consequential figure in Florida history at the time was none other than Fidel Castro.
The Soviets have a lot to thank Castro for. When he led his guerrilla forces into Havana against the dictator Fulgencio Batista 27 years ago, he achieved virtually the impossible. He established a communist satellite right on the doorstep of the United States.
I'm in the little Havana neighborhood of Miami, a city that's been so transformed by its immigrant population that it's almost unrecognizable.
The Cuban dictator took power on January 1st, 1959. Following the revolution, there was a mass exodus of Cubans leaving their homes and venturing to the United States. An exodus that would fundamentally reshape the Sunshine State. The first wave of immigrants were known as the Golden Exiles, largely middle and upper class Cubans. Many of these immigrants were given visas and refugee status as they fled communist oppression. Miami was a logical destination for them to head to given its sheer physical proximity. Between 1959 and 1962, the United States was admitting roughly 1,600 to 1,700 Cubans a week through commercial air travel. A luxury that would cease to exist in 1962 following the Cuban Missile Crisis. Some Cuban refugees would now have to risk their lives crossing the Florida Strait in makeshift boats and rafts, though most chose to enter commercially through other countries. Negotiations between the United States and Cuba would lead to the Freedom Flights, the largest refugee operation in American history, which brought 260 Cubans to the United States between 1965 and 1973. At the time, Cubans represented only 2% of the population in Miami-Dade. That number surged to a whopping 34% in 2010. Miami-Dade College history professor Paul George said in an interview, "It's ironic. He's the single most hated person by hundreds of thousands of people here, and yet he's the reason they're here. He's the reason they helped shape this place." According to Pew Research, 58% of Cubans vote Republican, compared to just 32% of non-Cuban Hispanics. And in 2016, Cubans had the highest voter turnout rate among eligible voters of any Hispanic group in America. The Cuban population in Florida exploded from 50,000 in 1960 to 580,000 in 1980, and now stands at over 1,200,000 people. Over the next few decades, the Hispanic, Latino, and Caribbean population in Miami and Florida as a whole would explode. It's difficult to imagine where the state would be today without some of its most influential immigrant groups, like the aforementioned Cubans, Colombians, Venezuelans, and even Brazilians, even though people often forget about us. The thing that I never realized made Florida so singular is how few of our residents were actually born here. In 1920, more than 85% of Florida's population had been born in the state, compared to less than 35% today. Florida experienced a huge influx of people coming from other states following COVID. In 2022, we had the highest amount of net migration out of any US state, with a net of nearly 250,000 people. And with that, I noticed that a lot of people started having stickers on their cars that said "Flow Grown" or "Local" with Florida forming the L, just to say that we're not like you, we're from here. And I was wondering how many of those people were actually born in Florida and how many of them are people that moved here that just predate the current population boom. I mean, I wasn't born here either. I came here when I was 3. Does that count as local?
I think of these gates in front of the houses as being very Latin. That's a very big thing that I remember from Brazil that you don't really see in the US most of the time.
Florida has become a haven for old people, largely because of this idea of the Florida dream. It's a place where life doesn't stop for older people. Tons of communities allow seniors to keep living active, exciting lives that they may not have found anywhere else. The Villages is a 55-plus community northwest of Orlando with nearly 80,000 residents. If you do the math here, Florida has a lot of seniors. Seniors tend to be more conservative, and they also tend to be the most consistent voters. I'm 23 years old, and Florida has never had a Democratic governor in my lifetime. The state has become considerably more conservative in recent years, as the voters coming from swing states and safe blue states tend to be more conservative of themselves. There's an elephant in the room that we haven't really addressed yet, the climate crisis. Between me starting work on this video and it being published, Hurricane Milton rapidly developed and made its way towards central Florida, not too long after Hurricane Helene. In 2023, Florida residents paid an average of nearly $11,000 in homeowners insurance premiums, and the trend line is predicted to go up even further. If places like Asheville that never expected to be hit by hurricanes can be so devastated, what happens to Florida in the future? It particularly hit the Tampa Bay area, which has been the epicenter of the population boom, growing a mind-blowing 39% since the year 2000. An Econofax study found that high-risk counties saw 3% faster growth than low-risk ones in the last 3 decades. As Americans keep moving to Florida, they find themselves on the front lines of climate change. Home insurance has gotten much more expensive nationally, and in Florida, where prices were already high, we feel the strain even more. Some insurance companies like AAA and Farmers Insurance left the state altogether, leaving thousands of residents searching for new coverage in a landscape of explosive prices. Marmino also discussed this idea of Florida becoming something else, something different from what had attracted people here in the first place. This idea that in the future, people might be nostalgic for the old days of the Sunshine State. They might say, I used to love Florida. A future where the Florida dream we've talked about so much is just an idealized memory of somewhere that doesn't exist anymore. When I think of Florida growing up, I think of every apartment complex having a pool and a little lake, spotting the iguanas behind my house, and teasing people for taking pictures of the same sunset. A sunset that if you've seen every day for your entire life feels a little bit less incredible. Never going to the beach that I've always been 15 minutes away from, complaining that I can never wear nice jackets and how the entire year blends together because seasons don't exist here. I'm not exactly sure what Florida's future looks like, and the more time goes by, the less I see a future for myself here, if I'm being totally honest. What do you guys think the future holds for Florida? And maybe even your own home state if you're willing to share. Thank you guys so much for watching. Like and comment on the video if you enjoyed, and you can also support on Patreon to get videos a whole week early.
As always, an extra special shout out to the homies Bobbletopia, Michael Lowe, John Reynolds, Luke Johns, Braden Shelby, Kenneth Choi, Crib Stack, and of course, Quack.
Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you later.